a broken wheelchair on a Los Angeles sidewalk, a CEO who had everything except freedom, a mechanic who had nothing except kindness. When Vanessa Holloway's chair seized up in front of 100 watching strangers, she laughed and made a promise she never meant to keep. But Landon Pierce didn't know that. He just knelt down and got to work. What happened next stopped traffic, silenced a crowd, and shattered every wall that wealth and pride had ever built between two people who had no business meeting at all. If this story moves you, hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The morning Vanessa Holloway's life changed for the second time started the same way every other morning did, with a schedule she'd written herself, a silence she'd chosen, and a city that moved around her like she was something fixed and permanent, while everything else rotated in orbit. She woke at 5:15 without an alarm. She'd stopped using alarms 3 years ago, not because her body had adjusted to the hour, but because sleep had stopped being something she trusted. Too many nights she'd lain awake until 3, 4 in the morning, listening to the hum of the air purification system she'd installed throughout the penthouse, a system that cost more than most people's cars, and staring at the ceiling she'd had custom commissioned by an artist she'd flown in from Milan. Beautiful ceiling, terrible company. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower in West Hollywood. 4,200 square feet of open layout, floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, a kitchen she barely used, a dining table that seated 12 for a woman who ate alone. She'd bought it 4 years ago when Holloway Tech went public, and her net worth crossed a number she still couldn't entirely believe when she saw it written down. She'd bought it because her financial advisor said it was a sound investment, because her PR team said it sent the right message, and because some quieter, more honest part of her wanted to live somewhere that felt as controlled as the rest of her life. It had never felt like home, but she'd stopped waiting for places to feel like home around the same time she stopped expecting sleep. She transferred from the bed to the chair in the gray pre-dawn light with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made the same movement 10,000 times and stopped noticing the effort years ago. Her arms were strong. She'd worked hard to make them strong, treating her upper body like it was something she needed to be worthy of since everything from the waist down had become unreliable. The accident had taken her ability to walk, her illusion of invincibility, and the man she'd been with at the time, though Marcus leaving was arguably the least damaging of the 3 losses. She'd realized that about 6 months after he went. The realization hadn't made her feel better or worse. It had just settled like everything else eventually settled, into the flat, manageable landscape of something that had happened and was now simply part of the geography. She showered in the custom-fitted bathroom. She dressed in the clothes her personal stylist had laid out the night before. A charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, tailored pants, all chosen for how they read in rooms where perception was currency. She did her makeup with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was armor, and then she navigated the open floor plan to the kitchen island, where her housekeeper Delia had already left coffee and a small plate of fruit and a handwritten note on a yellow sticky that said, "Your 9 o'clock called ahead." He sounds nervous. That's probably your fault. Vanessa read the note twice and allowed herself a half smile before drinking the coffee standing. Sitting, technically, but she'd always thought of it as standing, mentally if not physically. At the counter, looking out over a city that was just beginning to exhale after another night. She'd built Holloway Tech from the ground up, not from nothing. She was honest with herself about that, always had been. Her father Gregory had given her the first $3 million, which was $3 million more than most people started with, and she carried that awareness like a stone in her pocket at all times. But the direction, the product architecture, the culture, the partnerships, the 6 pivots in 4 years that had brought the company from a promising concept to a platform used by 48 million people, that was hers. She'd earned it in the specific and unglamorous way that things are actually earned. Long hours and bad decisions and corrections, and more long hours, and the willingness to be wrong in front of people and not let that paralyze her. She was good at not letting things paralyze her. She'd had practice. Her driver Marcus, different Marcus, she'd noted the coincidence when she hired him and filed it away as irrelevant, picked her up at 6:40. They went through the usual morning, 2 calls with the East Coast team that had already been working for 2 hours, a voice message from her VP of engineering that required a response, a news scan for anything affecting their sector. By the time they reached the Holloway Tech offices on Wilshire, she'd been working for an hour and 40 minutes. The day moved the way her days moved, with forward momentum and very little room for anything unplanned. She had 9 meetings. She sat through 8 of them from a conference room at the head of a table where everyone else sat on chairs that were technically equal to hers but weren't, and she knew they weren't, and they knew she knew. Power is a strange thing in a room. It doesn't always go where you expect. Some people assumed her wheelchair changed the calculation. They were usually wrong about that, and they were usually surprised by how wrong they were, and sometimes they were apologetic about their surprise, which was the thing she found most exhausting. The apology for the assumption, the performance of correction, as if their internal adjustment was something she needed to acknowledge and absolve. She'd gotten good at not letting her face show any of it. The one meeting she left early was with a software vendor whose product she'd already decided to pass on. She gave him 40 minutes instead of the scheduled hour and rolled out with the polite finality of someone who has been closing conversations since she was 26 and knows exactly when the sentence is done. By 2 in the afternoon, she had a gap in her calendar. This was unusual. Denise, her executive assistant, had carved it out weeks ago for a strategic planning session that got moved, and in the rescheduling, no one had filled the slot. And Vanessa had noticed it this morning and made the calculation. She could fill it with 3 more calls, or she could do something she hadn't done in longer than she wanted to admit. She could go outside and just be outside for an hour. It felt more radical than it should have. She recognized that. She told Denise she was stepping out and not to reschedule anything until 4. She told Marcus to take the afternoon. She went downstairs alone, which she rarely did, and pushed through the building's automatic doors into the Los Angeles afternoon like someone who wasn't entirely sure the world was going to hold. It held. The sidewalk was warm and the sun was the particular aggressive gold of a Los Angeles 2 o'clock in summer. And the air smelled of exhaust and jasmine in the way that LA air sometimes does, incongruous and oddly specific. She went east on Wilshire, taking the pavement at a pace that felt like freedom. This was the thing she couldn't explain to people who hadn't experienced it, that the chair, which represented every limitation and loss and adjustment, was also the mechanism of her independence. Without it, she was stationary. With it, she moved. The complexity of feeling gratitude for the thing you also resent was something she'd spent years untangling and had mostly given up trying to resolve. It was both. It was always both. She ended up at Café Mercier about 6 blocks from the office. It was a place she'd been to once before, 18 months ago, for a working lunch with a potential investor who'd ultimately passed and later regretted it publicly. She remembered the coffee being exceptional and the patio being wide enough for her chair, which was not something she could take for granted and was therefore not a small thing. She went to the counter, ordered an Americano and something made with almond flour that she didn't actually want but that Denise had noted on a nutrition plan she was only partially following, and then took the coffee outside. The patio was half full with the afternoon crowd. People with laptops. A young couple. 2 women who looked like they were celebrating something small and personal. A man in his 60s reading an actual physical newspaper, which felt almost theatrical. Vanessa found a spot near the planter boxes along the railing and sat with her coffee and let herself have the rare and slightly uncomfortable experience of not doing anything. She lasted about 4 minutes before she checked her email. 7 minutes after that, she noticed her chair wasn't responding the same way it had been. There was a resistance on the right side when she tried to move forward. A drag, slight but perceptible, like something catching. She tried again. The drag was still there. She looked down at the right wheel and saw nothing obvious, and then she tried once more, and the whole thing stiffened up with a grinding sensation that she felt through her hands and up into her wrists. And that stopped her cold. She pushed. Nothing. She pushed harder, shifting her weight to try to compensate. The chair made a sound she'd never heard it make, a metallic complaint somewhere in the wheel mechanism. And then it locked up completely. She sat very still for a moment. This particular wheelchair was a custom piece, engineered specifically for her measurements and usage patterns by a firm in Switzerland that made adaptive mobility equipment for people at the intersection of serious need and unlimited budget. It had cost more than a lot of people's houses. Her father had insisted on it after the 3rd chair she'd owned turned out to have a design limitation that caused her chronic back pain. And when Gregory Holloway insisted on something, he tended to pursue it with the same energy he'd used to build a $12 billion portfolio, which meant the Swiss firm had received a very specific and well-funded brief. The chair was supposed to be beyond breakdown. It was supposed to be engineered past the point of ordinary failure. She looked at it now, locked and immovable on a cafe patio in West Hollywood, and felt the very specific and familiar humiliation of her body, or the machine her body depended on, betraying her in public. She could call Marcus. He'd be there in 15 minutes. She could call Denise, who would call someone who would handle it. She had a backup chair at the office, an older model, less customized, that she kept for situations like this. She had resources. She had options. The logistics were solvable in a way that most people facing a mobility crisis wouldn't have access to, and she was not unaware of that. What she wasn't prepared for was the way the people around her responded, or rather, didn't. The two women celebrating something looked over. One of them, mid-30s, a wine glass in her hand, made eye contact with Vanessa, registered the situation, and looked away. Not meanly, just with the particular urban avoidance of someone who has been taught that staring is rude and has interpreted that lesson to include looking at someone long enough to consider whether they need help. The man with the newspaper glanced up and then back down. The couple at the far table didn't seem to notice at all. A server came out and walked directly past her to clear a nearby table and then went back inside without a word. Vanessa sat there for what felt longer than it was, probably 90 seconds, watching people make the calculation that someone else would handle it, or that they didn't want to intrude, or that she was fine, or some version of all three, and she felt the heat of it rise through her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something in the specific territory between those two that didn't have a clean name but that she'd visited before. She pulled out her phone, opened Marcus's contact, put it back down. And then, in the way that extreme frustration sometimes produces something unexpected from the back of the throat, she said, "Too loud, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear," in a voice that came out more raw and honest than she intended. "Oh, for the love of, you know what? If anyone out here actually wants to help with this, I'll marry them, I swear to God." It came out half desperate, half dark humor, the particular register of a person who has run out of polished responses and defaulted to something real. She said it to the pavement, mostly. Maybe to the locked wheel, maybe to the universe's very poor sense of comedic timing. She didn't expect an answer. She certainly didn't expect someone to say, from about 4 feet to her left, in a calm and completely matter-of-fact voice, "Okay, let me look at it." She turned. He was standing on the sidewalk outside the railing, not on the patio. He must have been passing, actually passing, not sitting, not lingering. And he was looking at her chair with the concentrated attention of someone who sees a mechanical problem and is already solving it in his head before he's fully committed to the conversation. He was average height, broad through the shoulders, wearing a gray t-shirt with a faded logo she couldn't read, and work pants that were clean but clearly used. There was grease under his fingernails that he'd made some attempt to wash out. His face was the kind of face that doesn't announce itself. Not striking exactly, not plain either, just present and direct, with the kind of lines around the eyes that come from squinting at things in bright light for years. He was carrying a canvas tool bag over his shoulder. He looked at her then, briefly, checking. Not her condition, not her chair, but her face, like he wanted to make sure she was okay with him approaching before he committed to the movement. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "Mechanical's my thing. Not wheelchair specifically, but mechanism. A short pause. "May I?" Vanessa stared at him. The patio around them had gone slightly still, that collective pause of a group of strangers who have all tuned in to the same moment without planning to. "You're serious," she said. "Yeah. I was joking about the—" She gestured vaguely. "The marriage thing." "I know." He was already moving toward the railing entrance, not presumptuous, still waiting for her actual confirmation. "I'm just talking about the chair." She looked at him for another second. At his hands, calloused and capable. At his face, which was showing her nothing complicated. No performance of goodwill, no angle she could immediately identify, just the straightforward attention of someone who had spotted a problem and had the tools to address it. "Fine," she said. "Yes. Thank you." He came through the gate and crouched beside the chair without any of the hovering awkwardness that people sometimes brought to being physically close to someone in a wheelchair, as though they were afraid proximity would somehow harm her. He just crouched and looked, tilting his head to examine the right wheel mechanism, and she watched him shift the bag off his shoulder and set it on the ground and unzip it. "Can you tell me what it felt like before it locked?" he asked. "Any kind of warning? Pull to one side?" Right side was dragging for a few minutes before it stopped completely. "How long ago?" "Maybe 10 minutes. He nodded and kept looking. He had a small LED flashlight in his hand now. She hadn't seen him take it out, and he was shining it into the wheel housing. "This is a Swiss rig," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." The locking mechanism on these uses a ratchet pawl system on the hub. They're great until they're not. He paused, squinting at something. "There's your problem. The pawl's jammed. Looks like a fragment of something got in there. Small debris. Happens more than the manufacturers like to admit." He looked up at her again. "I can get it out, but I need about 10 minutes and some actual light. That okay with you?" He said it like it was the most ordinary question, like he was asking if she wanted cream in her coffee. Vanessa, who had been managing people, teams, boards, investors, adversaries, for 9 years, and who was not accustomed to being managed by anyone, found that the straightforwardness of it disarmed her completely. "Yes," she said, hearing herself sound slightly less composed than usual. "That's okay." "Landon," he said, looking back at the wheel, an introduction as an afterthought. "Landon Pierce. Vanessa Holloway." "Okay." He was already working. He'd said it the way you say okay when someone tells you something that doesn't change what you were about to do. She watched him work. She'd been watched doing things publicly her whole adult life, giving talks, closing deals, navigating spaces that weren't designed for her, and she'd developed a considerable tolerance for observation. Watching other people was different. Watching him was different from watching other people. There was an economy to his movements that she found she couldn't look away from. No waste, no hesitation. He knew what he was looking for, and he went for it. And when he met a resistance, he adjusted and tried from another angle, and when something didn't work, he didn't appear bothered by it, just recalibrated. He talked while he worked, not to perform comfort, but because he was actually narrating his diagnostic process, which she gathered was a habit rather than a performance. The debris wedged into the pal housing. See, the problem with this particular design is the tolerances are really tight, which makes the chair incredibly responsive under normal conditions, but also means smaller particulate can cause a full lock. He had a pick tool now, working with focused precision. You'd be surprised what I've seen jam mechanisms. Once did an emergency repair on a concert grand piano. The action on 4 keys locked up the night before a performance. Turned out to be a guitar pick somebody's kid had gotten in there. Ridiculous. A pause. "Got it." He held up something between his thumb and forefinger. A fragment of what looked like broken pavement aggregate, barely 4 millimeters across. "That's it?" Vanessa said. "That's it." He didn't seem to find it as remarkable as she did. "But now I'm going to clean and relubricate the whole mechanism, and I want to check the other wheel too, because if this happened once, it'll happen again until we address the underlying issue." He glanced at her. "That's more like 40 minutes. You have somewhere to be?" "I have a 4 o'clock. "What time is it?" She checked. 2:40. "You're fine." Back to the wheel. She should have called Marcus. She should have called Denise. She should have handled this the way she handled everything, efficiently and through the appropriate channels, without sitting on a cafe patio watching a stranger with grease under his fingernails take her chair apart, component by component. She did none of those things. Instead, she watched Landon Pierce work, and the patio around them gradually relaxed back to its normal business, and the server came out and offered her another coffee with the slightly sheepish energy of someone who had noticed earlier and not acted and was now compensating. And Vanessa said yes, thank you, and the Los Angeles afternoon went on around them like it had somewhere to be. The server brought the coffee and set it within her reach without making a production of it. "How long have you been a mechanic?" she asked. It came out more naturally than she expected. "Since I was 17. He was working with both hands now, a careful and steady operation on the wheel assembly. "My uncle had a shop in Glendale. I went in after school to help out, initially for money, and then just because I liked it." A brief pause. "There's something satisfying about it. Something's broken. You figure out why. You fix it. The feedback's pretty immediate." "As opposed to?" "Most things." He said it simply, without irony. "Most things you do, it's hard to know if it made any difference. With mechanical work, you know." Vanessa considered that. It was, she thought, not an unfair observation. She spent a considerable portion of her professional life doing things whose effects she wouldn't know for months or years, if ever. "What kind of shop do you run?" she asked. "I don't run it. I work there. It's in Echo Park. General Automotive, some specialty transmission work." He paused. "Not my uncle's shop. Different place. My uncle retired 4 years ago and sold it. A beat. I thought about buying it. Didn't happen. Why not? He looked up briefly. There was something in the slight recalibration of his expression. Not closed, just more careful. Things don't always happen the way you plan them. She didn't push. She had the instinct to push. It was the same instinct that had served her well in business, the one that kept pulling at threads. But something in the economy of his answer suggested it wasn't evasion so much as genuine brevity. Some things don't need more than that. Do you live in Echo Park? She asked instead. Near there, Eagle Rock. That's a haul from West Hollywood. I was dropping something off for a friend. He's got a studio over here. A glance at the street. I don't usually come this far west. She absorbed that, the specific randomness of it. He was here because of a different errand, a different life, and had happened to be walking past at exactly the moment her engineered Swiss wheelchair chose to fail. The server had come and gone again. The couple at the far table had left. New people had arrived and taken their place, unaware of the minor drama that had already played out here. You have kids? She asked. She didn't know why she asked that. She'd been asking people questions all day, targeted, strategic questions designed to get information she needed. This wasn't that. He stopped working for just a moment. Not defensively, just the pause of someone who is about to say something that matters to them and wants to get it right. Yeah, he said. A daughter. She's 8. Back to the wheel. Her name's Nora. Just the two of you? Just the two of us. He said it with the particular plainness of someone who is completely at peace with the facts of their life and doesn't need them to sound any different than they are. Not self-pity, not bravado, just, this is how it is, and it's mine, and it's enough. She found that something she recognized in a sideways way, the aloneness that isn't loneliness, or at least tells itself it isn't. She's in school right now, he said. I pick her up at 3:15. That's usually the hard deadline on any job. You're going to make it. She checked the time again. You've got 25 minutes. I know, he said. And there was something in that, a certainty, a contained confidence, that wasn't arrogance exactly. Just the sureness of someone who has learned how to manage his time because there are consequences that matter if he doesn't. He went back to work. What Vanessa didn't notice, because she was watching Landon, was that she herself had become watched. Her father had arrived. Gregory Holloway had, in fact, been in the cafe itself. He'd been 2 blocks away when Denise, who tracked Vanessa's schedule as a professional reflex, had mentioned offhandedly that the CEO had taken an afternoon out. Gregory had sent a text that Vanessa hadn't answered because she'd left her phone in her bag, and then he'd walked over because he was 64 years old and still couldn't resist the impulse to be physically nearby when something was happening with his daughter that he didn't understand. He saw it from the cafe entrance before he made himself known. His daughter on the patio, the locked wheelchair, the man crouched beside it, working with quiet and focused competence. He stood in the doorway and watched. Gregory Holloway had not become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in California by being naive about people. He had extraordinary pattern recognition when it came to human motivation. He could see angles and agendas from across a room, had learned early that most people who came to him had something they wanted, even if what they wanted was harmless enough. He watched everyone through the lens of that awareness. It wasn't cynicism, exactly, just calibration, just reality. He watched Landon Pierce for 90 seconds, and he could not find the angle. That happened rarely enough that he noted it. The man was working on Vanessa's chair with the focused attentiveness of someone who simply wanted to solve a problem. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't angling toward the conversation in any particular direction. When Vanessa asked him questions, he answered them directly and honestly, and when she didn't ask, he worked in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Gregory had spent millions on the wheelchair, the custom engineering, the modifications, the fitting process, the follow-up adjustments. He had good people working on it. The Swiss firm sent quarterly diagnostics, and all of that was genuinely useful. He knew that. But watching his daughter on the patio, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. She was relaxed. Not medicated relaxed or performed relaxed, or the careful management of appearance she brought to every public setting. Actually, genuinely relaxed in the way that a person is when they've briefly forgotten that other people might be watching. She was talking to this man, this stranger she'd encountered by chance, with the naturalness of someone who didn't have to calculate every word first. Gregory had not seen Vanessa talk to anyone like that in years. He went to the counter and ordered a coffee he didn't particularly need, and then found a seat by the window and waited. Outside, Landon finished his work on the second wheel and did a final check of the axle housings. He wiped his hands on a cloth from his bag and looked up at Vanessa with an expression that was, she realized, slightly apologetic. "I want to be upfront with you," he said. "What I've done is going to get you through the short term. I cleaned and lubricated both wheel assemblies, extracted the debris, checked the ratchet pawl on both sides. But the underlying issue, why the debris got in there in the first place, is a gap in the housing seal on the right side. It's worn. You need a replacement part from the manufacturer, or someone with access to Swiss spec components." He met her eyes steadily. "I can't fix what I can't get parts for. This will hold for a while, but it's not a permanent solution." She stared at him. She was accustomed to people presenting her with solutions. She had a team whose job was to bring her solutions, finished and ready. She was not accustomed to people presenting her with their own limitations as a form of honesty. "How long will it hold?" she asked. "A few weeks, if you're careful. Maybe more." He closed the tool bag. "Get someone to look at the seal soon. It's not an emergency right now. But it will be." "Okay. Okay," he echoed. He stood, shouldering the bag, and there was a brief and slightly strange moment where neither of them said anything, and Vanessa became abruptly aware that this interaction, which had felt inevitable and ongoing while it was happening, was about to be over. "Try it," Landon said. "Tell me if the pull is gone." She positioned her hands on the wheels and pushed. The chair moved, smoothly, cleanly, without resistance, without drag, without the slight grinding hesitation she'd gotten so used to over the past several months that she'd stopped fully registering it. The chair simply moved in the effortless way that it had when the Swiss firm first delivered it 4 years ago, and she'd tested it in their facility in Zurich, and she'd thought, yes, this is it. This is what it's supposed to feel like. She hadn't felt it since then. She hadn't even realized she'd stopped feeling it. She pushed forward a few more feet and then turned, smoothly, precisely, and pushed back. The ease of it moved through her like something she didn't have a word for. Not just relief. Something older than relief. Something that hit in the chest and behind the eyes, and she had to stop and breathe through it for a second because she was on a public patio in West Hollywood, and she was not going to cry in front of a cafe full of strangers. She turned back to look at him. He was watching her with a mild and attentive expression. He'd seen her reaction to the chair moving correctly, and he hadn't made a performance of his own satisfaction about it. He just watched to make sure it was right. "It's good," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Good," he nodded. "Remember what I said about the seal?" "I will." She hesitated. The calculation she made in the next second wasn't the usual kind. Not strategic, not political, just the ordinary human arithmetic of, he did something for me and I want to acknowledge it without making it weird. "Can I—" She stopped. "I want to pay you for your time. I know this wasn't—" "No," he said. Not harshly. Just the same directness he'd been giving her the whole time. "I was walking by. It's fine." "It's more than an hour of your—" "It's fine," he said again, and the firmness in it was not unkindness. It was just a door, gently but clearly closed. "I'm glad I could get it moving." He glanced at the time. On a regular watch, the analog kind, she noticed, on a worn leather strap. "I have to get to pickup," he said. "Go." She meant it. "Thank you. Genuinely." He looked at her then, just looked for a moment, the way someone looks when they're registering something and deciding what to do with it. And then he said, "Take care of yourself, Vanessa Holloway," in the same tone he'd said everything else, practical and warm and not performing either one. And then he walked off the patio and back to the sidewalk and headed east in the direction of whatever his actual life was, the canvas bag over his shoulder, and within 30 seconds he was gone around a corner and the patio had absorbed his absence the way it absorbs everything, which is to say, it simply continued. Vanessa sat with her coffee, which had gone cold. Her phone showed 2 texts from Denise, one from the general counsel and one from a board member. The 4 o'clock. The actual functioning world of her actual functioning life. And also her father, who came through the cafe door at that moment with a coffee cup in his hand and an expression he was working hard to keep neutral, and who sat down across from her without asking and looked at her for a long moment before saying, quietly, in the voice he used when something had actually moved him. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "The chair? It's fine." She pushed forward and back to demonstrate. The ease of it was still there, still clear. He fixed it. Gregory was quiet for a moment. He looked at the corner where Landon had disappeared. "Who is he?" "A mechanic." She picked up the cold coffee. "He was walking past." Her father nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something he hadn't expected and hadn't fully categorized yet. He'd spent 64 years building systems for understanding the world, and occasionally something fell outside those systems and he had to just sit with it for a while. "He didn't want anything," Gregory said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Vanessa said. "He just fixed the chair." She held the coffee cup in both hands, not drinking it. Outside, Los Angeles moved around her in its usual way, constant and varied and indifferent, and she sat in a wheelchair that moved the way it was supposed to move and thought about a man who had somewhere to be at 3:15 and a daughter named Nora, and enough honesty to tell her when he'd reached the limit of what he could fix. She thought about the way the chair had felt when she pushed it forward, the cleanness of it, the ease. She thought, "I haven't felt that in 4 years." And then she thought about something else he'd said, something small and ordinary, a throwaway answer to a throwaway question that she kept returning to without entirely understanding why. "Most things you do, it's hard to know if it made any difference. With mechanical work, you know." She put the cold coffee down. She was going to be late for her 4 o'clock. She didn't move for another 10 minutes. She made the 4 o'clock. Barely. Denise had rescheduled the general counsel to 4:30 without being asked, which was why Denise had worked for her for 6 years and would, Vanessa suspected, continue to work for her until one of them retired. She rolled in at 3:58 with cold coffee on her breath and something unresolved still sitting behind her sternum, and she sat through 90 minutes of legal review with the focused attention she brought to everything, while some quieter part of her mind kept returning to a corner in West Hollywood and a canvas tool bag and a man who had checked his analog watch and gone to pick up his kid. She didn't tell anyone about the afternoon, not because there was anything to hide, there wasn't, but because she didn't yet have language for what had happened that didn't sound either smaller or larger than it actually was. A stranger fixed my chair. That was true, and also insufficient. She sat with the insufficiency of it through the evening, through the dinner she ate alone at the kitchen island while reviewing quarterly projections on a tablet, through the flat television light she used to fill the penthouse later in a way she'd never admitted to anyone was loneliness management. The chair moved correctly when she navigated to bed. She noticed it again. The ease of it. 4 years, she kept thinking. 4 years of that slight resistance. That friction she'd absorbed into normal until she'd forgotten normal was supposed to feel different. She fell asleep faster than she had in months, which she noted and chose not to analyze. The next morning, she called the Swiss firm from her car on the way to the office and reported the seal issue on the right wheel housing. The woman on the phone, a product specialist named Ingrid, who spoke English with the precise formality of someone who had learned it in a classroom, confirmed the part number and said they would ship a replacement and arrange for a certified technician to perform the installation. 3 weeks, possibly 4. Vanessa thanked her and ended the call and looked out the window at the freeway and thought about a man who had diagnosed the same problem in 40 minutes with a flashlight and a pick tool. She did not search for him online. She told herself this was because she had other things to do, which was true, but also because looking for someone felt like doing something, and she wasn't sure she'd decided yet whether to do something. That lasted 6 days. On the 7th day, a Tuesday, she was in the back of the car going through contracts when her phone showed a news alert, something local, a feature story in a Los Angeles lifestyle publication about adaptive sports, which had somehow populated in her feed. And the article mentioned a community mechanic program in Eagle Rock that was providing free vehicle maintenance for low-income families with disabled members. Eagle Rock. She closed the article, opened her email, closed that too. She typed Eagle Rock Mechanic into her phone's search bar, and then stopped herself and put the phone face down on the seat. What was she doing? Marcus caught her eye in the rearview mirror for a second and then diplomatically looked away, which was one of the things she appreciated about him, his extraordinary professional capacity for seeing nothing. The thing was, and she understood this about herself, she did not pursue things she hadn't decided to pursue. That was almost a structural feature of her personality. Her therapist, She'd seen someone for 2 years after the accident, and occasionally still did, had said once that Vanessa treated her own emotional life the way some people treat their finances. She tracked everything, categorized everything, and made no withdrawals without prior calculation. At the time, she'd taken it as a neutral observation. Later, she'd recognized it was less neutral than that. She knew why she was thinking about Landon Pierce. It wasn't complicated. At the base level, he had been genuinely kind to her in public in a way that was unrehearsed and without calculation, and that was rarer than it should have been in her life. The people around her were kind in the way that people are kind to powerful people, carefully, with awareness of what their kindness signals and what it might return. It wasn't insincere exactly, it was just never entirely simple. She'd gotten used to it. She'd stopped expecting otherwise. He hadn't known who she was. Or rather, he'd heard the name Vanessa Holloway, and it had produced exactly nothing in his expression. Either he genuinely didn't know, or he knew and genuinely didn't care, and either way the effect was the same. He'd crouched beside her chair and gotten to work and spoken to her like a person, which ought to be a low bar and somehow wasn't. She picked the phone back up, typed the search differently this time. Eagle Rock Auto Repair Shop, 7 results. She narrowed by proximity to the neighborhood center. 3 shops looked plausible. She looked at the reviews on each, not for the quality of the repair work, though the quality was apparent enough, but for the texture of the language people used. 2 of the shops had the generic praise of places that had solicited reviews. One of them had the specific particular praise of people who were describing actual experiences. Landon stayed 2 hours past closing to finish my transmission job because he knew I had work the next morning. Charged me the same rate. Don't know what to say about that except it's not nothing. Honest diagnosis. Didn't try to sell me on repairs I didn't need. That's worth the drive from Burbank. My daughter's adapted van needed something specialty, and they figured it out when 3 other places said they couldn't. Landon Pierce specifically. Give that man a raise. She read that last one twice. Holloway Tech had a fleet of vehicles. Some of them were due for service. It was not unreasonable. She turned this over, testing it for the self-deception she had enough self-awareness to check for. It was not unreasonable for the company to diversify its service providers, including exploring local independent shops. That was a rationalization, and she knew it. She went anyway. She told her driver she needed to make a stop in Eagle Rock and gave him the address, and sat in the back of the car with the contract she was no longer reading while Los Angeles scrolled past the window, and she considered, not for the first time, that she was perhaps not as controlled as she generally presented. The shop was called Pierce and Morales Auto. It was on a side street 2 blocks off Colorado Boulevard, the kind of business that had been in the same building for long enough that the building had absorbed its character. Good signage, worn concrete, 3 lifts visible through the open bay doors, a small waiting area visible through a window in the front. Clean. Not performatively clean, just actually clean, in the way that a working space is clean when the person running it cares about the work. She rolled to the front door and went inside. The waiting area had 4 chairs, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a rack of automotive magazines from several months ago. There was a service desk along one wall, unmanned at the moment. From behind the door that led to the bays, she could hear the specific orchestral quality of a working shop, air tools, radio, 2 people talking over the sound of both. She waited. After a minute, the door opened and a man came out, mid-50s, broad-built, wearing a shop shirt with Morales stitched on the chest, holding a tablet and looking at it. He looked up and saw her, and the tablet went to his side. Help you? Not unfriendly, just a man who had a lot of things to do. I was hoping to speak with Landon Pierce, she said. If he's available. Morales' expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion, just attentiveness, the recalibration of someone trying to sort out what kind of customer this was. She was in a different chair today, the older backup model from the office, and she was wearing what Denise called her civilian outfit. A simple blazer over a plain shirt, no visible signals of the scale of her professional life. She'd done this deliberately, though she hadn't fully admitted to herself that she was doing it deliberately. He's finishing something up, Morales said. 5-10 minutes? That's fine. He disappeared back through the door. She heard briefly the sound of someone being told he had a visitor, and then the music and tools reasserted themselves and she waited. He came through the door 7 minutes later, wiping his hands on a cloth, and she watched him see her and stop. Not dramatically, just stop. A brief recalibration, the same thing Morales had done, but with more to work with, because he recognized her. Vanessa Holloway, he said. Then, Huh. It was, she thought, a remarkably honest response. Hi, she said. Sorry to come by without calling. I didn't have a number. No, it's... He tucked the cloth into his back pocket and came fully into the waiting area, and he didn't quite know what to do with his hands for a second, which was the first moment she'd seen him look anything other than entirely settled. How's the chair? That's part of why I'm here, she paused. The Swiss manufacturer is shipping the part for the seal. They said 3 to 4 weeks. That sounds about right for their lead times. He'd recovered his footing, back to the direct attentive quality that was just how he operated. He pulled out the chair from behind the service desk and sat, not leaning back, forearms on the desk. What's the other part? The question surprised her. Most people wouldn't have noted that she'd said part of why she was there. I wanted to thank you properly, she said. You left before I had the chance. Or before I found the right words, maybe. You thanked me. I said thank you. That's not the same thing. She held his gaze. What you did? I've had that chair for 4 years, and the resistance in the wheel was there for at least the last year and a half. Maybe longer. I'd stopped noticing it. When you fixed it, I noticed what it was supposed to feel like. A brief pause. She was saying more than she'd planned, but the words were already in motion. That matters. More than I expected it to. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable. He seemed entirely comfortable with silence in a way that a lot of people weren't, just considering. You drove out to Eagle Rock to tell me that, he said. It wasn't skeptical, just factual. I drove out to Eagle Rock to tell you that, she confirmed, and to ask if your shop has ever worked on fleet vehicles. Holloway Tech has 14. We use a service out of Culver City currently. I'd consider moving the contract if you're interested in talking about it. Now he was quiet for a different reason. She watched him process it, not the flattery of it, which didn't seem to particularly register, but the practical reality of it. 14 vehicles. A corporate contract. The math of what that meant for a 2-bay independent shop in Eagle Rock. That's a significant offer, he said carefully. It's a business conversation, not an obligation. She meant that, and she thought he could tell she meant it. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm exploring whether your shop is a good fit. If it's not, it's not. He looked at her steadily for a few seconds. Why would you move a working contract? Because the current service is adequate, and I think adequate is a low bar. She kept her voice even. And because I'd rather work with someone who knows what they're doing and will tell me honestly when they don't. That's harder to find than it should be. Another pause. He unfolded his arms and leaned back slightly, and she could see him genuinely thinking about it, not performing consideration, but actually running through the logistics in real time. Space. Staffing. The difference between servicing personal vehicles and a corporate fleet with maintenance schedules and documentation requirements. I'd need to talk to Morales, he said. This is his shop as much as mine. More technically, he's got the majority stake. Of course. And I'd need to know what fleet vehicles mean specifically. What kind, what mileage, what the service history looks like. I can have that information sent to you today. He nodded, slow, still working through it. Can I ask you something? Yes. If I say no to the contract conversation, he picked his words with some care. Does that affect whether you're standing here? She understood what he was asking. He was asking whether the business offer and her being there were the same thing or different things, and whether his answer to one changed his situation regarding the other. It was, she thought, an extremely perceptive question and exactly the right one to ask. No, she said. They're separate. He nodded again, and she thought she saw something in his expression relax slightly, like a tension she hadn't noticed before resolving. Okay, he said. Send the fleet information. I'll talk to Morales. Give me a few days. Take whatever time you need. She started to turn the chair and then didn't because there was something else she'd been carrying around for a week and hadn't resolved. Your daughter, she said. Nora. He looked at her with a different quality of attention. You said she was 8. Vanessa paused. My company has a partnership with a program called Open Path. It's an after-school STEM initiative, engineering and design. They have a waiting list, usually about 4 months. She met his eyes. I can make a call, if she's interested. No obligation, no connection to the contract discussion. Completely separate. The expression on his face was difficult to read. She'd gotten reasonably good at reading people's expressions, and this one was layered in a way she hadn't encountered much. There was the practical surprise of the offer, and underneath it, something more guarded, the wariness of a parent who has learned to be careful about what gets into their kid's life and why. She likes building things, he said slowly. She's always taking stuff apart to see how it works. A half-beat. Like someone else I know. The last 4 words were said quietly, and not to Vanessa exactly, more like he was noting something to himself. You don't have to decide now, she said. I know. He stood, and she realized that for the past several minutes she hadn't thought about the chair at all, which was a more notable thing than it might sound like to someone who'd never experienced its opposite. Can I show you something? He said. She'd expected him to walk her out. Instead, he pushed open the door to the bays and held it for her, and she went through into the working part of the shop. The smell hit her first, oil and metal and the specific sharp cleanness of a well-maintained workspace. 2 vehicles on the lifts, a third on the floor with its hood up. Morales was under the far one, visible only from the waist down. A younger guy in his 20s was doing something at the workbench along the far wall. Landon led her past the vehicles to the workbench area and gestured to something on the table. A disassembled piece of machinery, spread out in components with the careful organization of someone who knows exactly where everything came from and where it's going back. What is it? She asked. Wheelchair drive motor, he said. Power chair, different kind than yours. Belongs to a kid, 14 years old, lives down the street. His family brought it in 2 weeks ago. The motor's shot and the replacement part is $600, which... He stopped. They don't have $600. She looked at the components laid out on the bench. What are you doing with it? Trying to rebuild it. The motor itself is gone, but I think I can swap in an equivalent from a mobility scooter that came in as junk last month. Different specs, but I think I can make it work. He picked up one of the components, turned it in his hands. It's not the right fix. Ideally, he'd have the proper replacement, but it's better than what he's got, which is a chair he can't move. She looked at the components for a moment, at his hands holding the piece, at the quiet concentration in his face, even while he was explaining it to her, like part of his attention was already solving the problem. How long have you been working on it? She asked. Few evenings. He set the piece back down with precision, exactly where it had been. It's not a paying job. Morales knows. It's fine. From the back of the shop, Morales' voice came up from under the car. Did he tell you he's been here until 9 every night this week? Landon turned toward the sound with an expression that was approximately equal parts irritation and acceptance. That's not relevant, Ray. Seems relevant. The voice was entirely unbothered. Tell her the part's not free either. The scooter motor was junk. It came in as, you paid the estate sale $40 for it. That's not nothing when you've got rent. Vanessa looked between the direction of the voice and Landon's expression, which had settled into the patient resignation of a man who works alongside someone who will say the true thing at any available opportunity. I'm going to stop having conversations in front of you, Landon said toward the car. Seems wise, Morales agreed, and went back to work. Vanessa looked at the motor components again, the careful organization, the hours. The proper replacement part, she said, $600. Something like that. I'd like to cover that. He looked at her immediately, and the look was careful. She recognized it as the same look he'd given her when she tried to pay him for the cafe repair. She got ahead of it. This isn't about you, she said plainly. I don't know that kid. I don't know his family, but a 14-year-old shouldn't be sitting still because his motor's shot and nobody has $600. She kept her voice even. That's just a problem that can be fixed. You don't have to be involved in it. He was quiet for a long moment. You'd be paying it to the family, he said. Not through me. However, it makes sense. I'll give you the contact information. He paused. You should know. They'll probably ask how this happened. I'll have to tell them someone offered. They may want to thank you. That's fine. They're proud people. The mother especially. I'm not trying to make anyone feel like a charity case. She held his gaze. I just want him to be able to move. There it was again. That almost imperceptible shift in his expression, something that moved behind his eyes and then settled. Like a recalibration of something he'd been assuming. He gave her the family's contact information. She put it in her phone. She turned the chair toward the bay door, and he walked with her, not ahead and not behind, just alongside. in the natural way of someone who isn't thinking about what it looks like. Outside in the afternoon light, Morales' voice drifted out from the bay. "Nice to meet you, Vanessa Holloway." Landon put a hand over his face briefly. She laughed, not the careful, managed sound she produced in professional settings, but an actual laugh, which surprised her by arriving before she'd made any decision about it. "You too," she called back. By the car, Marcus appeared from where he'd been waiting with the professional invisibility he was so good at, and opened the door. She paused beside it. "The fleet information will be in your email by end of day," she said. "Okay." Landon had his hands in his pockets. He looked at her in the afternoon light with the same direct and uncomplicated attention he'd given everything else. "Thank you for coming out here. Thank you for not making it weird." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "I'm trying." She got in the car. Marcus closed the door and she looked out the window, and Landon was already walking back toward the bay, not watching her go, just returning to the work that was waiting for him. And she sat back in the seat and felt something she couldn't entirely name that was warm and slightly uncomfortable in the way that things are when they're real. Her phone rang. She answered it. The rest of the afternoon reasserted itself. But the kid's family got a call from her office by 5 o'clock, and by Thursday, the $600 had been handled through Holloway Tech's Community Outreach Fund, without anyone having to feel like a charity case. And she got a voicemail that Friday from a number she didn't recognize, a woman's voice, careful and dignified and genuinely moved, that she listened to 3 times before saving it to a folder she'd never had a reason to create before. She labeled it simply, Eagle Rock. She didn't look at it again that week, but she didn't delete it either. The fleet contract came through on a Friday. Morales called to confirm it, not Landon, which Vanessa noted. And the conversation was brief and professional and ended with Morales saying, in a tone that suggested he was not a man who said things he didn't mean, "We'll take good care of your vehicles, Ms. Holloway." She believed him. The first 3 Holloway Tech vehicles came into Pierce and Morales the following Monday. Vanessa knew this because she asked Denise to flag it, and then immediately told herself that was a normal thing to do when establishing a new vendor relationship, and then recognized that she was justifying herself to herself, which was a sign that something was operating below the level of rational management. She didn't go to Eagle Rock that week, or the week after. What she did do was think about the kid with the power chair, the 14-year-old whose name she'd learned was Darian, whose mother had left that careful, dignified voicemail. More than she expected. She found herself thinking about the motor components spread out on the bench, the organization of them, the hours Landon had put in after closing quietly without telling anyone who might have made it mean something other than what it was, just a man who saw something broken and couldn't walk past it. She had spent her adult life surrounded by people who gave to things. She had a philanthropic arm at Holloway Tech, a giving framework she'd developed with a consultant, targets and metrics and impact assessments. She was not naive about the complexity of charity, who it served, who it didn't, the gap between intention and effect. She'd had those conversations. She'd read the literature. She thought she understood the landscape of generosity reasonably well. What she hadn't fully accounted for was what it looked like when it wasn't organized. When it was just a man staying until 9 o'clock on a Tuesday because a kid down the street couldn't move. And that seemed to him like a problem he could do something about. She was, she admitted to herself, late on a Wednesday night, with the penthouse quiet around her, thinking about Landon Pierce quite a lot for someone who had decided not to do anything particular about it. What moved it from thought to action was, as it often is, something unplanned. She was at a dinner, the kind of dinner she attended 8 or 9 times a year, necessary and well-organized and designed to produce connections, a fundraiser for a children's literacy initiative at a hotel in Beverly Hills. She was at a table with 6 other people, including a film producer she'd met twice before, and a city councilwoman and a foundation director who spent most of dinner explaining the importance of his foundation. The food was the kind of food that is technically excellent and somehow forgettable, and the conversation moved in the smooth, safe circuits that conversations at these tables tend to move in. At some point, the councilwoman, a direct, sharp woman named Patricia who Vanessa genuinely liked, leaned over and said quietly, "You look like you're somewhere else." Vanessa looked at her. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's paying attention, Patricia poured herself more water. What is it? Nothing specific, just... She paused, looking for honest language. Do you ever feel like you're doing everything correctly and something is still wrong? Patricia considered that for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. I feel that about twice a week, she said. I've been trying to figure out the difference between something being wrong and something being incomplete. She glanced at Vanessa with the frank appraisal of someone who has been in rooms like this long enough to see through most of what happens in them. For you, I'd guess it's incomplete. Vanessa drove home thinking about that word. She called Landon the next morning. She had his number. It had come through the contract paperwork, and she'd looked at it a few times without using it. He answered on the third ring. There was shop noise in the background. "This is Vanessa Holloway," she said, which she immediately recognized was unnecessary because he had her number now too, but it came out anyway. "Yeah, I know." Not unkind, just straightforward. The background noise shifted like he'd moved somewhere quieter. "What's up?" The directness of it, she realized, was one of the things about him that she couldn't stop thinking about. Not rude, just transactional in the best sense. He said what he meant and waited for you to say what you meant. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to feel free to say no. I'm going to try to say it clearly so there's no ambiguity about what I'm asking." A brief pause. "Okay." "My company has a community outreach event in 2 weeks. We're partnering with the Open Path program, the one I mentioned to you, the after-school STEM initiative. It's a Saturday afternoon at our Pasadena facility. Hands-on design challenges for kids, some equipment demonstrations, a few engineers from our team there to talk about their work." She kept her voice even. "I thought Nora might enjoy it, and I thought you might be willing to bring her not as anything complicated, just as something to do on a Saturday." The line was quiet for a moment. "Just Nora?" he asked. "You'd both be welcome. I'll be there." A pause. "I know this feels like I'm orchestrating something." "Are you?" The question was so direct it almost made her laugh. "I don't know," she said, which surprised her by being true. "I thought I wasn't. Now that you're asking, I'm less sure." Another silence, but different from the first. More like he was actually sitting with the honesty of that answer rather than deciding what to do with it. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes. I've been careful the last few years about what I let into Nora's life." He said it without apology, but also without aggression, just as a fact she was owed. "Not everything, just certain things. New people especially. I have to be." A pause. "She lost her mom when she was 4. She's a resilient kid, but she also attaches, and people don't always stick around." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "I understand," she said, and then, because she thought he deserved more than that, "I'm not making you a promise. I think that would actually be worse, promising something I don't know how to keep. What I can say is that I'm not impulsive about people. I wasn't before the accident, and I'm not now. I don't show up in places I'm not sure about." She heard him exhale slowly. 2 weeks, he said. "The Saturday?" "The 15th, noon to 4. Let me talk to her." A beat. "She'll probably want to come. She's been asking about engineering programs since I mentioned the Open Path thing, actually." "You mentioned it to her?" "She asks about my week." A slight shift in his voice, something warmer. "She's 8. She wants to know everything. It's exhausting, and it's the best thing about my life." Another pause. "I'll let you know." "Okay." She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap, and the city doing its morning thing outside the car window. Marcus, with his extraordinary professional vision, saw none of it. He texted her 2 days later. Not a call. A text, which felt somehow more considered, like he'd thought about the medium. "She wants to come. We'll be there at noon." The L at the end. She read it 3 times. She typed back, "Good. See you then." She stared at it for a second and then added, "She'll like the robotics station. Tell her to ask for a woman named Claire. She builds things that don't work until they suddenly do, and she's great with kids." She sent it before she second-guessed it. The reply came 40 minutes later. "Will do." The 2 weeks between that text and the Saturday felt both long and fast in the way that anticipatory time always does. Vanessa caught herself preparing for the event with more personal investment than the other 11 events she had on her calendar that month, which she recognized and tried not to indulge too conspicuously. She talked to Claire about Nora without saying exactly how she knew the child or why it mattered, and Claire, who was 31 and built robots in her spare time and was one of the 3 or 4 people at Holloway Tech Vanessa genuinely delighted in, said, "Got it. I'll be good," with the easy confidence of someone who is always good with kids and knows it. The Pasadena facility was a converted warehouse, high ceilings, good light, the kind of industrial space that had been thoughtfully redesigned without losing what made it interesting. By 11:30 on the Saturday, there were 40 kids registered and a team of 12 Holloway engineers setting up stations, and Vanessa was navigating the floor doing the thing she always did at events, which was simultaneously run logistics in her head and make every individual person she talked to feel like they had her complete attention, which was a skill she'd developed early and never stopped using. She saw them come in at 12:02. Nora Pierce was small for 8, with her father's dark eyes and a deliberate quality to her movement that made her look like she was paying attention to everything simultaneously. She was wearing a shirt that said "Science is cool" in block letters that had clearly been chosen by herself rather than a parent, and she was holding Landon's hand, but not in the clingy way of an anxious child, more in the way of a kid who reaches for a specific person out of preference rather than need. Landon had made some effort with his appearance. Not a lot. Not in a way that was uncomfortable or unlike himself, but a clean shirt, dark, not a work shirt, and he'd done something with his hair that suggested a mirror had been consulted. Vanessa noticed all of this in the first 4 seconds, and then looked away before he caught her noticing. He didn't catch her. He was looking at the space, taking it in with the measured attention he brought to everything, while Nora pulled slightly forward and was already scanning the room with bright and systematic interest. Vanessa crossed to them. "You found it okay?" she said. "GPS works," Landon said, and then the corner of his mouth. "Good to see you." She looked at Nora. "Hi, I'm Vanessa." Nora looked at her with the frank, unburdened appraisal of a child who hasn't yet learned to perform polite uncertainty. "Dad said you fix problems," she said. "For a company." Vanessa glanced at Landon, who seemed to be looking at the ceiling briefly. "That's pretty much right," she said to Nora. "What kind of problems do you like to fix?" "Anything that's broken." Nora said it with absolute conviction, the way only 8-year-olds and a few extraordinarily grounded adults can say something. "Dad says you have to look at the broken part first before you can fix anything else. You can't just guess. Your dad's right about that." "He's right about most things," Nora said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact. "He's wrong about bedtime. But most things." Landon put his hand briefly on top of Nora's head, and she ducked away from it without breaking eye contact with Vanessa, which made Vanessa want to laugh in the unguarded way she'd laughed in the shop parking lot and hadn't expected. She took them to the robotics station first, because she'd told him about Claire, and she wanted to see if the recommendation held. It held. Within 6 minutes, Nora was elbow-deep in a partially assembled rover component, with Claire crouched beside her explaining actuator mechanics, with the focused joy of someone who spends most of their professional life explaining things to adults who pretend to follow along. Landon stood a few feet back, watching. Vanessa positioned herself beside him. Not close exactly. There was appropriate space. But alongside, in the way she'd noticed he stood alongside people rather than opposite them. "She's good," he said quietly, watching Nora. "Nora or Claire?" "Both." They watched Nora interrogate Claire about why one of the joints wasn't responding correctly. Claire started to explain, and Nora interrupted with a question that made Claire stop and actually reconsider her answer. And Claire said, "Okay, that's actually a really good point," with the genuine surprise of a person who wasn't expecting to be challenged by an 8-year-old. "She gets that from you," Vanessa said. "The not letting go of a question until the answer makes actual sense." Landon looked at her sideways. "You've spent about 4 hours with me total." "I know." She paused. "You're not hard to read. That's not a criticism." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people say I'm closed off. You're not closed off. You're just economical." She chose the word carefully. "You don't give more than the situation requires. That's different from closed off." He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, it wasn't about that. "How long have you been doing these events?" "The Open Path Partnership is 2 years old. The format has changed a lot. First year was a disaster, actually. Too many kids, not enough structure. The engineers were great, but had no idea how to explain their work to children, and the children had no patience for the learning curve." She paused. "We lost 3 kids to a supply closet for 40 minutes. Fire Marshal was not thrilled." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. something open and slightly delighted. You're joking. I wish I were. Where were you while 3 kids were in a closet? Arguing with a catering vendor about whether 20% cashew trail mix qualified as an allergy risk. It does not. They had strong opinions. She shook her head. It was a very bad afternoon. He laughed. A real one. Not the polite version, but the actual sound of a person genuinely amused. And it hit her somewhere behind the ribs in a way she chose to simply note and move past. They moved through the facility over the next hour. The structural engineering station, where Nora built a bridge from popsicle sticks and tested its load capacity with increasing weights until it failed magnificently and then immediately started asking why. The design lab, where she spent 20 minutes with a junior engineer named Tomas, who had the patience of a saint and the energy of someone who had consumed significant caffeine. A demonstration from a materials scientist that Nora found less interesting, and said so with a diplomatic honesty that made the materials scientist, to his credit, laugh rather than take offense. Vanessa stayed with them most of the time, breaking away occasionally when something needed her attention, and returning without making a production of the returning. She noticed that Landon tracked her even when he was focused on Nora. Not possessively, just with the awareness of someone who keeps inventory of the people in a space they're responsible for. At some point in the early afternoon, they found themselves at a quieter corner of the facility, Nora occupied at a coding station with Claire, and Vanessa and Landon standing at the perimeter with coffee from the event's refreshment table that was serviceable and nothing more. "Can I ask about your father?" Landon said. It surprised her. "Gregory? I read about him after I met you." A pause. "I looked you up. I should have said that earlier." "That's fine." She meant it. "What about him?" "The articles talk about what he's built, the scale of it." He held the coffee cup in both hands, looking out at the room. "They don't say much about him as a person." She considered that for a moment, the specific terrain of Gregory Holloway, as a topic of honest conversation. She'd had the public version of this conversation 100 times. She was less practiced at the private one. "He's complicated," she said. "He built something real. The company, the portfolio, all of it. He works harder than anyone I've ever met," which sounds like praise and is. "But it also means that for most of my childhood, he was somewhere else." She paused. "He's a better father now than he was when it was most critical. I've made a kind of peace with that. It's not a complete peace, but it holds." Landon nodded. "After the accident," she continued, and she was saying more than she usually said, she knew that, but something about the specific quality of his attention made it feel like the right room for the right words. He redirected a significant part of his energy into fixing it. Me. Or the circumstances around me. The chair, the apartment modifications, the medical team, every resource he had. She looked at her coffee. It was love. I know it was love. It was also the kind of love that doesn't know how to sit with something it can't solve. "Hard to receive," Landon said. "Very hard to receive." He was quiet for a moment. "Nora's mom," he said, and she could hear him deciding how much to give, "left when Nora was 3. Not... She didn't die then. She got sick the following year. Ovarian cancer. She was 31. A pause. "We weren't together anymore when it happened, but I was there at the end because she didn't have a lot of people and Nora needed someone to hold it together." He said it plainly, with the particular flatness of someone who has told this story enough times to have smoothed it into something manageable, while the actual weight of it remained in the room between the words. It changed a lot of things, obviously. But the thing I think about most is that Nora doesn't remember her well. She has a few things: photographs, a video I saved from a birthday when Nora was 2, but mostly what she has are my memories of her mother, and I'm aware that's not neutral. I'm aware I'm the filter. "That's a heavy thing to carry," Vanessa said. "It is." He glanced at Nora across the room, who was now arguing cheerfully with the coding program about why her logic should have worked. "She's okay, though. She's genuinely okay. I don't know if I did that, or if it's just her. I think it's mostly her." "You don't give yourself credit." "I don't know how to measure it." He looked back at Vanessa. "I don't know how to know whether the choices I made were right. I can see she's okay today. I can't see back and know which things I did made the difference." A brief pause, and there was the faint ghost of a smile in it. "Can't run the same kid twice with different variables." "No," she said. "You can't." She thought about what he'd said, the thing about not being able to know, and about her own life and the choices she'd made since the accident, the work she'd redirected herself into, the walls she'd built in the name of control, the long nights in a penthouse that cost more than most neighborhoods and that had never once felt like refuge. All the things she'd done that she thought were right and couldn't prove. For what it's worth, she said carefully, from the outside, looking at the two of you for one afternoon, you're doing something that looks like the right thing, however you got there. He was quiet for a moment, then, thank you. Not deflecting, not minimizing, just receiving it, which was, she thought, its own kind of rare. Nora's voice cut across the room. Dad, come look at this. It's doing the wrong thing and I don't know why. Landon set his coffee down. Duty calls, he said, and went. Vanessa watched him cross the room, watched Nora grab his hand and pull him toward the screen, watched him crouch down and look at the code with the same focused attention he'd given her wheelchair on a West Hollywood patio on an afternoon that had apparently redirected something in both their lives. She stayed where she was for a moment longer than she needed to. The afternoon wrapped up at 4 with the particular pleasant exhaustion of an event that had gone mostly well. Nora had made a small rover component that actually moved. Claire helped her finish it, and she was holding it in both hands with the reverence of someone transporting something fragile and important when they came to say goodbye. Can I come back? Nora asked Vanessa directly, without preamble. Vanessa looked at her. There's another event in 2 months, she said, if your dad says it's okay. Nora turned to Landon with the full-body persuasion of an 8-year-old who has already decided the answer. Dad. I heard her, Landon said. So we'll see. That means yes, Nora told Vanessa confidentially. He says, we'll see when he means yes. He says, let me think about it when he actually has to think about it. We'll see is just yes with extra steps. Landon looked at the ceiling again briefly. Good to know, Vanessa said. They walked to the parking lot together, Nora between them, still holding the rover component. At Landon's car, a 10-year-old truck, clean, well-maintained in the way of something that belongs to someone who knows exactly how things go wrong if you don't stay ahead of them. Nora climbed in and buckled herself and held the component in her lap and was apparently immediately absorbed in something she was narrating quietly to herself about the day. Landon stood by the driver's side door. Thank you, he said. She'll be talking about this for a month. She earned it. She's sharp. She is. He said it without the performance of parental modesty, just as a fact he was proud of in a way he didn't need to manage. And thank you for what you said, earlier, about the two of us. He paused. It mattered. She nodded, holding that. Not deflecting the way she might have 6 weeks ago. Drive safe, she said. He got in the truck. She rolled back toward the facility entrance, and the parking lot evening light was the color of something she didn't have a word for exactly, and she could hear Nora's voice through the cracked truck window, asking her father something she couldn't quite make out. And she heard Landon's answer, low, patient, real, and the truck backed out and headed toward the parking lot exit. She sat for a moment. Her phone showed 4 unread messages from Denise, 2 from the board, 1 from her father. She opened her father's first, which was unusual. It said, I heard the event went well. Good. Call me this week when you have time. She looked at it. Then she put the phone away and sat in the empty parking lot and let the day settle around her like something she hadn't expected to want and didn't know yet what to do with, which was, she thought, actually a decent place to be. Uncertain in a way that felt like possibility rather than threat. She stayed there a few minutes longer than she needed to. Then she went inside to help her team break down the stations, because that was also who she was. And because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is show up for the ordinary work at the end of a day that changed something. Gregory Holloway called on a Wednesday. Vanessa was in the middle of reviewing a vendor proposal when her phone showed his name, and she set the proposal down and answered because she'd learned years ago that ignoring her father didn't make him go away, it just made him more creative about finding other approaches. You've been busy, he said. Not an accusation, just Gregory's version of an opening. I'm always busy. This is different. A pause. Patricia Chen told me about the outreach event. She said you stayed to break down equipment afterward. Patricia was there? She was on the literacy board. She saw you in the parking lot. Another pause, longer. She also said you seemed... Her word was lighter. I'm quoting her because I'm not sure it's my word to use. Vanessa looked out the window at the city doing its afternoon thing. What did you want to say, Dad? He took a breath. This was Gregory's tell, the breath that preceded something he'd rehearsed. I want to have dinner with you, and with Landon Pierce if he'd come. The silence that followed was the kind that has shape. You looked him up, she said. Of course I looked him up. You're my daughter. Not defensive, just the plain reality of a man who has been running due diligence on things that matter to him for 40 years and sees no reason to stop. There wasn't much. Small business, good reputation, no red flags of any kind. What I found told me more about what wasn't there than what was. A pause. No angles. No public-facing ambition. No social media footprint worth mentioning. No obvious reason for him to be in your orbit. He was walking past. I know. I was there, Vanessa. The shift in his voice was slight but real, something underneath the businessman's careful diction. I watched him fix your chair. I've thought about it almost every day since. He paused. I've spent a lot of money over the years trying to make things better for you. The right equipment, the right people, the right access. I'm not apologizing for that, but watching someone do something useful with 40 minutes in a tool bag, it was a different thing. A beat. I'd like to meet him properly, if that's not overstepping. She thought about what Landon had said. I've been careful about what I let into Nora's life. She thought about being the person who got to decide what went into someone else's life, and how serious that was, and whether she had the right. I'll ask him, she said. I'm not promising he'll say yes. I know. And then, quieter. I'm proud of you. I don't say it enough. You don't, she agreed. But thank you. She asked Landon 2 days later on a Friday afternoon in a text that she drafted 4 times before sending. The final version was direct and slightly formal, which she recognized as her protective instinct operating, and she sent it anyway. My father would like to have dinner with us. You, me, him. No agenda beyond wanting to meet you properly. You're allowed to say no, I mean that. He took 3 hours to reply. When? She stared at that single word for a moment and then smiled at her phone in the empty back seat of the car, which was the kind of thing she was glad Marcus could not see. The dinner was on a Thursday, 3 weeks out, at a restaurant in Los Feliz that was good without being a statement. Vanessa had chosen it carefully, specifically to avoid anywhere that Gregory's name on the reservation would produce a special room and extra attention and the machinery of wealth made visible. She wanted a regular table. She wanted it to feel like something ordinary, which was, she understood, itself a kind of management, but it was the best she could do. She arrived first. She always arrived first. Punctuality was a value she held without particular philosophy behind it, just the plain belief that other people's time mattered. The restaurant was warm and not too loud, and the table was in a corner booth that she'd specifically requested because corner booths were accessible without performance. Gregory arrived 4 minutes later, which was early for him, which told her something. He looked well, she thought. 70 was approaching but hadn't arrived yet in any visible way, and he had the contained energy of a man who still got up at 5:30 and still found the day insufficient for everything he wanted to do with it. He was wearing a sport coat over a plain shirt, no tie, which was Gregory making an effort to seem casual in a way that was endearing and slightly transparent. He kissed her on the cheek and sat down and looked around the restaurant with the brief automatic assessment of a man who has walked into a lot of rooms and cannot entirely stop measuring them. Good choice, he said, understated. I'm trying. He looked at her with something genuine in his expression. How are you really? It was a question he'd gotten better at asking over the last decade. Earlier in her life, he'd asked how things were, projects, companies, outcomes. The shift to asking how she was had been gradual, and she thought probably hard-won, and she gave it the credit it deserved. I'm good, she said. Honestly? Not managed good? Actually good. He nodded. Landon came through the door at 7 exactly, and she could tell immediately that he'd thought about this, about the room, and what it asked of him, because he came in with the measured steadiness of someone who has decided not to be thrown by things before they happen. He was wearing a dark jacket she hadn't seen before, a little stiff in the way of something recently acquired, and he'd made the same effort with his appearance as he had at the Pasadena event, genuine but not performance. He spotted her and came directly to the table. Hey, he said to Vanessa, and then turned to Gregory and extended his hand. Mr. Holloway. Gregory shook it and said, Gregory, please. and Landon sat down across from him with the self-possession of a man who has sat across from difficult people before and knows how to hold his ground without making it a confrontation. There was a brief silence of the kind that happens at a table where no one is entirely sure yet what kind of conversation this is going to be. Gregory broke it. I want to say something before we get into the pleasantries, because I'm not very good at pleasantries, and they usually just postpone what I actually want to say. He looked at Landon directly. I was at the cafe that afternoon. I watched you work on Vanessa's chair. Landon glanced at Vanessa briefly, and she gave him a small nod that said, yes, I knew, and yes, this is who he is. Okay, Landon said. I've spent years, Gregory said, trying to solve the problems that followed my daughter's accident. Good solutions, most of them. Expensive solutions. The chair you fixed cost more than some cars. He paused. You got it working correctly in 40 minutes, and I don't say that to diminish what I've done. I think what I've done has mattered, but I've been thinking about the difference between solving a problem for someone and solving a problem with someone. He stopped. I'm not entirely sure what my point is. I just thought you should know I saw it. Landon was quiet for a moment, and Vanessa watched him decide how to receive this. This large, complicated man sitting across from him, extending something that was not quite an apology and not quite a thank you, but lived in the territory between them. I just fixed what was broken, Landon said. That's what I know how to do. I know, Gregory said. That's what I'm talking about. The food came. They'd ordered without drama, Gregory getting the pasta he clearly wanted and not what he thought he should order, Landon getting the burger without apologizing for it, Vanessa getting the salmon she'd been planning on for 3 hours. It was such a small and ordinary set of choices, but something in the ordinariness of it settled the table into something that felt less like a meeting and more like a meal. The conversation moved, not smoothly. There were moments of friction, which was appropriate given who these three people were and what they each carried into the room. Gregory asked about the shop with the directness of someone doing research, and Landon answered with the patience of someone who doesn't mind being researched as long as you're honest about it. Vanessa watched them calibrate to each other, two men who operated differently but shared a fundamental orientation toward things they believed in, and felt something she recognized as relief, not because it was going well, but because it was going real. At some point, Gregory said, "Tell me about your daughter." And Landon said, "Nora." And the whole quality of his face changed in the way that it did when Nora came up. Not softer exactly, just more present, like a room where more lights had come on. He told them about the Saturday mornings they spent at the shop when the school calendar allowed, Nora in her own small work apron that she'd decorated with stickers, handing him tools with the serious focus of someone who had decided this was important work. He told them about the school project she'd built last spring, a model of a bridge suspension system that her teacher had put on display in the front hallway. He told them about the bedtime arguments that were, in practice, negotiations, and that Nora approached with the same logical framework she applied to everything, presenting counter-evidence for later curfews with an earnestness that made it impossible not to laugh even while holding the line. Gregory listened to all of it with the attention of a man who knew, from the vantage of age, exactly what was being described. "She sounds like someone I know," he said, looking at Vanessa. "Don't," Vanessa said. "You built a working radio at 9, he said to Landon, "from components. Presented it to me with footnotes about why it worked." "That's actually impressive," Landon said. It was. Gregory looked at his daughter with something unguarded in his expression. "I didn't tell her that enough at the time. I thought the footnotes were excessive." "They were excessive," Vanessa said. "They were thorough," Gregory said. "There's a difference." He paused. "I learned it late." The table held that for a moment. Later, when Gregory had excused himself to take a call, he'd been deferring for 20 minutes, Vanessa and Landon sat across the table in the specific quiet of two people who have just been in a room with something true and are still close to it. "He loves you very much," Landon said. "He just doesn't know how to make that not about fixing things." She looked at him. "When did you figure that out?" "About 10 minutes in." He turned his water glass slowly. "My uncle was like that. Everything he cared about, he'd try to build something around it. Buy it, fix it, make it better. Sometimes what something needs is just to be left alone." A pause. "I don't say that critically about your father. I mean it descriptively." "I know." She paused. "It took me a long time to understand that he couldn't help it, that it was how he said I love you." She looked at her plate. It was easier to be angry at it when I thought it was about control. Harder once I understood it was the only language he had. Have you told him that? That you understand? She considered the question honestly. Not in those words. Maybe worth doing, he said mildly, in a tone that wasn't pushing, just offering, the way he offered most things, without insisting you take it. Gregory came back and the conversation found different ground. The city, the neighborhoods changing, a project Gregory was involved in near the LA River that he described with more animation than he'd shown about most things. And by the time they left the restaurant 2 hours later, something had shifted between all three of them in a way that didn't need to be named to be real. On the sidewalk, Gregory shook Landon's hand again and held it slightly longer than the first time. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for the dinner. A pause. She's lucky to have someone who doesn't give up on the problem. Gregory looked at him for a moment. So is Nora. Landon accepted that with a small nod, and they went their separate ways into the night, and Vanessa stayed on the sidewalk for a moment with her father, watching Landon's truck pull into traffic. Well, Gregory said. Well, she agreed. He's the real thing, Gregory said, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary, applied to very few people in Vanessa's memory. I know, she said. Her father put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not a hug. Gregory had never been a hugger, but the hand on the shoulder was his version of the same thing, and she'd learned to recognize it as such. And then he walked to where his car was waiting, and she sat on the sidewalk in the October night and let the evening finish settling. The call came 17 days later. It was from Denise at 7:40 in the morning, which was not unusual. Denise called early, but the tone was unusual, the careful flatness of a voice delivering something that needs to land cleanly. There's a story, Denise said, coming out this afternoon, one of the tech media outlets. They have a source inside Holloway Tech. Vanessa felt the specific cold clarity that serious news always produced in her. What's the story? They're claiming the Meridian acquisition last year involved insider information, that someone on the board knew about the target's proprietary algorithm before the deal was public. A pause. They're naming you. She sat with that for a full 3 seconds. Who's the source? We don't know yet. The outlet reached out to our PR team for comment this morning. Don't comment yet. Get legal on the phone. I want the full acquisition documentation pulled. Every communication, every timeline. And I want to know by noon who could have talked. She paused. Does my father know? His office called 2 minutes ago. Okay. She took a breath. Get me a room. By 9 o'clock, she was in a conference room with her general counsel, her chief compliance officer, and 2 members of the legal team, and they were going through the Meridian acquisition with the focused urgency of people who understand that the difference between a story and a crisis is sometimes just hours. The allegation, as it developed through the morning, was specific, that Holloway Tech had obtained a non-public technical document from Meridian's development team before the acquisition offer was made, and that the document had been used to set the terms of the deal in a way that could constitute securities fraud. Vanessa had not seen that document before the deal closed. She was certain of this the way she was certain of a small number of things in her professional life, not because she trusted her memory generally, but because the Meridian acquisition had been contentious internally, and she had been scrupulously careful with the information she touched and when. What she was less certain of was who else might have seen it, and who might have talked. The name that emerged by midday through the careful forensic work of her compliance officer cross-referencing access logs and communication records was someone she'd trusted. James Whitfield had been on her board for 3 years. He'd come recommended by 2 investors she respected. He was 60, silver-haired, the kind of man who gave speeches about corporate ethics at conferences and had never given Vanessa any reason to look twice at his actual conduct. The access log showed that Whitfield's credentials had been used to access the Meridian technical document 36 hours before the offer was finalized. His credentials, which could have been shared, could have been used by someone else. The log didn't tell her who had actually done it, only whose access had been used. She called him at 2:15. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been expecting the call. James, she said. Vanessa. A pause. I've seen the story. I need you to tell me the truth. Right now, before this gets any larger. She kept her voice level. Did you access the Meridian technical documents before the offer? a silence that lasted too long to be innocent. It was due diligence, he said. I was trying to protect the company's... That's not what I asked. Vanessa, the acquisition was... Did you access the documents? The silence this time had a different quality, the quality of a man who has run out of road. Yes, he said. She closed her eyes for approximately 2 seconds. And the outlet? Did you talk to them? Another pause. I was approached. They had information already. From where? I don't know. I confirmed some of it. His voice had shifted into something defensive and slightly pitiful, which she found harder to hold than anger would have been. I was trying to manage the narrative. I thought if I shaped what came out, you thought confirming a story to a reporter was managing the narrative. I thought, stop. She held the phone and breathed through the anger that was clean and cold and entirely productive. I want your resignation by end of day. I want it unambiguous and I want it public, which means I want it to say clearly that you acted independently and without the knowledge or direction of Holloway Tech leadership. A pause. You owe the company that, James. You owe me that. And frankly, you owe it to the 46 employees whose positions depend on this company not being in the middle of a securities fraud investigation. Another silence. And if I don't? His voice had found some small reserve of resistance that she suspected he'd regret. Then we let the documentation tell the story, she said. The access logs, the timeline, the communication records, they're quite detailed. A pause. Your choice. The resignation letter came through at 4:47. The story ran at 5. It named Whitfield, it named the board, it named Vanessa, but with the resignation in hand and the clean documentation her legal team had prepared, the narrative shifted within 90 minutes from systemic fraud to one director's unauthorized action. Not clean, not without damage, but survivable. She was in the conference room at 7 o'clock, the legal team packing up around her, when her phone showed a text from Landon. Saw the news. You okay? 3 words and a question. She looked at them for a long moment. She typed back, not great, but standing. She paused and then added, chair's working fine if that's what you're asking. His reply came in under a minute. That's not what I was asking, but good to know. And then, Nora wanted me to tell you she figured out why her code wasn't working, said you'd want to know. She sat in the conference room with the lights still on and her general counsel still shuffling papers nearby, and she read that last text and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the board, or the acquisition, or the story, or any of the machinery of her professional life. She typed back, tell her I want to hear the whole explanation, every detail. This time the reply took a few minutes, and when it came it was a photo, a crumpled piece of paper with what looked like a hand-drawn diagram in crayon and pencil, the logic of a small person's code written out in a combination of actual notation and invented symbols that made complete sense within its own system. At the bottom, in Nora's handwriting, large and slightly uneven, this is why it works now. Vanessa looked at the photo for a long time. Then she looked at the conference room around her, the legal pads, the laptops, the 20 years of work that had built everything in this room and everything outside it, and she felt the two things simultaneously, which she was learning was how most real things arrived. The weight of what she'd built and what today had cost her, and the specific lightness of a photo from an 8-year-old who had figured out why her code worked and wanted her to know. She saved the photo. She went home. The penthouse was the same as always, beautiful and expensive and quiet in the way that things are quiet when they've been engineered for it. She made tea she didn't particularly want, and sat by the window and looked at the city and thought about what Landon had said at dinner, about her father, about how sometimes what something needs is just to be left alone. She thought about what it would mean to leave herself alone for a while, not to manage or measure or calculate, just to see what was there. It was a harder thing than it sounded. She texted her father, "You were right about him." She didn't explain what she meant because she didn't need to, and because Gregory Holloway had learned, late but genuinely, that not everything needed to be solved in order to be answered. His reply came 20 minutes later. I know. Get some sleep. She almost did. The week after the Whitfield story broke was the kind of week that reveals what things are actually made of. Not the company. Holloway Tech held. The documentation was clean, the legal team performed well under pressure, and the board moved with the decisive efficiency of people who understood that the alternative to decisiveness was a longer and more expensive version of the same bad news. 3 investors called to express concern, and Vanessa talked to each of them personally, directly, without the buffer of PR language, because she'd learned years ago that people will accept difficult truths more readily from a person than from a statement. The stock dipped 7% and recovered 4 of those points within 48 hours, which her chief financial officer described as better than it deserved to be, and which Vanessa took as a reasonable verdict. What the week revealed, beyond the company's structure, was her own. She slept badly for 3 nights. Not the familiar insomnia of a busy mind, but the specific sleeplessness of someone replaying a betrayal, looking for the moment she should have seen it coming, and coming up mostly empty. Whitfield had been careful, or she had been insufficiently suspicious, which was a different thing and one she was more willing to sit with. She was not, she knew, particularly good at suspecting people she'd decided to trust. She tended to do her evaluation work on the front end and then extend something close to full credit once she'd made a positive judgment, which had served her well most of the time and occasionally produced exactly what had just happened. She thought about this late on the 3rd night, sitting at the kitchen island with tea that had gone cold and the city outside the windows doing its 3 in the morning thing, which was quieter than the city deserved to be given how much of it never actually stopped. She thought about the pattern of it, the careful vetting, the extended trust, the occasional catastrophic exception. And she thought about Landon, who had arrived with no vetting at all, unscheduled and unvetted, a man walking past on a sidewalk, and had given her nothing to be suspicious of in the months since. Every conversation, every text, every afternoon in his orbit had produced the same clean reading. This is what it is, and nothing more complicated. This is a person who doesn't have a secondary agenda because a secondary agenda would require more maintenance than he has energy for after raising a child alone and running his professional life with integrity. She thought, I trust him more than I trust most of the people I've chosen carefully. She thought about what that meant and didn't try to resolve it into a decision at 3 in the morning because 3 in the morning is not the hour for decisions. It is the hour for sitting with things until they show you their actual shape. By the end of the week, she had a cleaner picture of the shape. The Swiss replacement part for her wheelchair arrived on a Friday, 2 days earlier than projected, which she noted as the exception rather than the expectation, and the certified technician came on a Saturday morning to install it. He was competent and professional and done in 40 minutes, and she thanked him, and he left, and she took the chair out onto the terrace in the thin November morning and pushed herself in a slow circuit of the space and felt the same ease she'd felt after Landon fixed it on the cafe patio, that clean and frictionless movement that she still hadn't entirely stopped noticing even after weeks. She called Landon from the terrace. Seal's installed, she said when he picked up. Chair's perfect. Good. She could hear the shop in the background. It was a Saturday morning, which meant he was probably in early, working through something before pickup. Ingrid do good work? Ingrid sent a technician. He did good work. Happy to hear it. A pause. How are you doing? With the other thing. She'd been getting that question a lot from a lot of people, in a variety of registers. Concerned, strategic, curious, performatively supportive. From Landon, it landed differently because it wasn't filling space. He actually wanted to know. I'm okay, she said. Genuinely. The hard part was the 3 nights in the middle when I couldn't stop thinking about what I missed. She paused. I'm past that. Or mostly past it. What'd you land on when you were thinking about it? That I didn't miss anything obvious. He was careful, and that I should probably calibrate my trust extension slightly differently going forward. A beat. And that I'm not going to become a suspicious person. That's not who I want to be. No, he agreed. Morales does something like that, doesn't he? Extended trust and then holds the line when it gets violated. A brief pause that she could feel him smiling through. You've been watching Ray. He's instructive. He would love to hear you say that, and I'm never telling him. Another pause. What are you doing today? The question landed simply, without scaffolding. Not what are your plans, not are you free, just what are you doing today? Present tense. The ordinary question of someone who is thinking about you in the way of the present tense rather than the future conditional. Nothing that matters yet, she said. Nora has a thing she wants to show you. She's been talking about it for a week, and I told her I'd ask. He said it casually, but she heard the slight care underneath the casual, the place where he'd considered how to frame it so that she had room to say no without it being a thing. He was always doing that, building exit ramps into his invitations, not because he expected her to use them, but because he wanted her to know they were there. What thing? She built something. A pause. She won't tell me what it is, which is either impressive restraint or a sign that it doesn't work yet, and she's still troubleshooting. Vanessa was already rolling back toward the terrace door. Tell her I'm coming. She heard him relay this, his voice muffled for a moment, and then Nora's response from somewhere nearby, a sound of pure and uncomplicated delight that cut straight through whatever remained of the week's accumulated weight. Noon? He said, coming back. Noon. She drove herself. This was not something she did frequently. The adapted car was there and she used it, but she defaulted to Marcus because his presence simplified logistics, and she was accustomed to using the drive time for calls. Today, she didn't want calls. She wanted the freeway and the radio and the particular experience of moving through a city under her own direction, which was a thing the accident had made complicated and which she had spent years rebuilding access to, one adaptation at a time. The 110 to Eagle Rock on a Saturday morning was its own kind of meditation. Loose traffic, the city spreading out in the November light, the hills to the north doing what the hills always did, which was look permanent and reliable in a way that nothing built by people quite managed. She took the Colorado exit and came through the neighborhood streets she'd learned over the past months, the ones that knew her now, the way you come to know a neighborhood you visit regularly, in the specific way of, left here, right there, the bakery with the pink awning that always smells like something worth stopping for. She parked on the street outside Pierce and Morales, and the shop was Saturday, quiet. One car on a lift, no music today. Morales visible through the window at his desk doing something administrative with the expression of a man who finds administrative work approximately as enjoyable as a root canal, but approaches it with the same mechanical discipline he applies to transmissions. He saw her through the window and raised a hand. She raised one back. Landon came out of the side door that led to the back of the property, where there was a small yard she'd seen once before through the chain link, concrete and a folding table, and the ghost of someone's attempt at a garden that had mostly given up. He was in a clean shirt, no jacket, and he was holding 2 coffee cups in a way that suggested he'd heard the car. Right on time, he said. Always. She took the offered cup. It was real coffee, not the event table variety, and she recognized the beans from a roaster in Atwater Village she'd mentioned once in passing that she liked. And she chose not to remark on this because remarking on it would make it a thing when it was quietly just a thing he'd done. She's in the back, he said. She made me promise not to go in yet. She's been setting up since 9. Setting up what? She won't say. He held his coffee with both hands and leaned against the wall of the building, looking toward the backyard with the fond and slightly baffled expression of a parent who has spent 8 years marveling at a small person who continually exceeds his ability to predict her. She asked me last week if we had any spare motors. I said what kind. She said any kind. I gave her an old wiper motor from a parts bin. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday evenings in her room, and I'm under strict orders not to look. Vanessa looked at him. You followed the orders. Mostly. The corner of his mouth. I looked once, couldn't tell what it was. Dad, Nora's voice came from behind the gate to the backyard. I can hear you talking about looking. I said mostly, he called back. That's still looking. A pause. You can come in now, both of you. He pushed the gate open and she went through first and into the yard, where Nora Pierce had arranged the folding table in the center of the space and draped it with what appeared to be a piece of canvas from the shop, and on top of the canvas was... Vanessa took a moment to understand what she was seeing. A small mechanism. Built from what looked like a combination of hardware store components, the wiper motor, several pieces of PVC pipe, and what appeared to be a section of conveyor belt material from some previous project, held together with bolts and wire ties, and in 2 places what looked like industrial tape applied, with the conviction of someone who has run out of more elegant solutions. It was roughly 18 inches across. It had a small control arm extending from one side, clearly designed to be operated by hand. And along its surface, there was a series of rollers, the PVC pipe sections spaced evenly, that formed a kind of track. Nora was standing beside it in her shop apron, decorated with its stickers, with her hands clasped in front of her in the posture of someone who is trying very hard to seem calm and not quite managing. "Okay," she said. "So," Vanessa waited. "I've been thinking about your chair," Nora said. "Not the wheel part. Dad fixed that. The other part." She gestured at the mechanism. "When you go somewhere and the floor isn't flat, like gravel or like those bumpy curb things, there's a kind of wheel design that adjusts to uneven surfaces. I looked it up. It's called a compliant mechanism. And I tried to build one that demonstrates how it would work." She paused. "It doesn't work exactly right yet. The roller spacing is off. But the principle works." Vanessa looked at the mechanism, then at Nora. "Can you show me?" she said. Nora picked up a small wooden block, about 2 inches thick, and placed it under the track, creating an uneven surface. Then she turned the control arm, and the rollers moved and the track distributed across the obstruction without jamming, each roller responding independently to the height change. It wasn't perfect. 2 of the rollers stuck momentarily, and Nora had to give the control arm a second push. The tape on the far end was visibly starting to lift. The whole thing looked like what it was, which was something built by a child in a bedroom over 2 evenings. But the principle worked. Vanessa could see it clearly, saw the logic of it, the actual mechanical insight underneath the imperfect execution. She looked at it for a long moment. "Nora," she said. "The spacing is wrong, I know," Nora said quickly. "If the rollers were closer together and the motor was stronger, the spacing is a calibration problem," Vanessa said. "That's engineering. You can fix calibration." She looked at the girl. "The idea is correct. The principle is right. Do you understand how unusual that is?" Nora looked at her with the careful attention of someone who is deciding whether to believe the compliment. "Dad says ideas are free," she said. "It's the execution that costs you." "Your dad is right," Vanessa said. "And your execution has problems. But your idea is sound. That's the hard part. Most people can learn execution with enough time and practice. The idea is rarer." Nora turned to look at her father with an expression that said, "Did you hear that?" Landon was looking at the mechanism, and his face was the face she'd learned over these months, the one that didn't show much on the surface, but that she'd learned to read in its smaller signals, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was holding something he didn't have words for yet. He looked at Vanessa and said quietly, "Thank you." She shook her head slightly. She hadn't said it to be kind. She'd said it because it was true, and there was a difference, and she thought he knew her well enough by now to know the difference. They stayed in the yard for another hour. Nora walked Vanessa through the mechanism component by component, explaining each decision with the animated precision of someone who has been waiting for an audience that would actually follow along. Landon got more coffee. At some point, Morales came through the gate to retrieve something and spent 10 minutes looking at the mechanism with the professional appraisal of a man who has been around mechanical things his entire life. "Roller spacing's off," he said. "I know," Nora said. "If you reduce the gap by about a third and use a lighter motor." He picked up one of the PVC rollers and examined it. "These are too heavy for the torque you're working with. You need something lighter. I think there's some aluminum rod in the back." He set it down. "I'll look." Nora watched him go back through the gate and then turned to her father with an expression that was 5% smug and 95% delighted. "He thinks it works," she said. "He said the spacing was off," Landon pointed out. "He offered to fix it. That means he thinks it works." She turned back to the mechanism with renewed energy. "Can I take it apart and redo the rollers today?" "After lunch," he said. "Can we eat fast?" "We can eat at a normal speed." "Dad." "Normal speed, Nora." She made a sound of theatrical suffering and went to put the canvas back over the mechanism, treating it with the careful reverence of someone covering something that matters. They ate at a taco place 2 blocks away that had 6 tables and a line that moved fast and food that was the kind of food that needs nothing added to it. Nora ate quickly and talked even quicker, cycling through the mechanism in the Open Path program, and a book she was reading about structural engineering for young readers, and a fight she'd had with a friend at school that had apparently been resolved, but that she still felt deserved some post-resolution analysis. Vanessa watched her and felt, with a clarity that was neither managed nor measured, something she'd been carrying toward for months without having a clean name for it. She loved this. Not the taco or the yard or the November light or even this particular afternoon. She loved this. The specific texture of it, the ordinariness, the noise, the way Landon intercepted Nora's elbow before it went into the salsa, the way Nora said Dad, in approximately 7 different emotional registers within 30 minutes, the way he answered each one with the same patient and inexhaustible presence. She loved what it felt like to be at this table. She sat with that, quietly, while Nora explained why the friend had been wrong and also slightly right, and she didn't try to manage it or categorize it or decide what it meant. She just let it be there, true and warm and slightly terrifying in the way of things that matter. After lunch, Nora went back to the shop with Morales to look for aluminum rod, and Landon and Vanessa walked the 2 blocks slowly, the way you walk when there's no particular reason to hurry. "She's going to take that thing apart and rebuild it tonight," he said. "Probably. And the night after. Until it works." "Yeah." He glanced sideways at her. "She gets that from somewhere." Morales offered to help. That's good. Morales pretends to be indifferent to her and then spends 3 hours helping her debug things. He's been like that since she was 5. A pause. "He's the closest thing to an uncle she's got. He'd hate to hear me say that." "Then don't tell him." "I won't." He looked forward at the street. "My uncle, the one with the shop. He came to Nora's last birthday, drove up from San Diego, stayed the weekend." A pause. "He told me on the last morning that I'm a good father. He's not a man who says things like that easily. He said it plainly, as information, not fishing for anything in response. I've been thinking about it since. Whether it's true." "Do you think it is?" "Some days." He turned the water bottle he'd brought from lunch slowly in his hands. "Some days I think I'm getting the big things right and missing something in the edges that I won't see until it matters. That's the fear, I think. Not failing visibly. Failing in the small things you can't track." "That's parenthood," she said. "Isn't it? That's the thing nobody can actually tell you in advance. That you'll do most of it right and some of it wrong, and you won't always know which is which." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Did your father feel that?" She considered it honestly. "I think he felt the version of it that people feel when they've translated love into action and can't always see the gap between the two." A pause. "He thought providing was the same as present. He wasn't entirely wrong, say, the providing mattered, but they're not the same thing." She glanced at him. "You don't have that problem." "I have different problems." "Everybody has different problems." He smiled at that, brief and real. They were back at the shop. Through the window, she could see Nora at the workbench with Morales, already deep in something, the shop apron on, the focused attention that she brought to any problem she'd decided to solve. "I want to tell you something," Landon said. He said it with the particular gravity of someone who has been working up to a sentence for longer than the conversation suggests. She waited. "When I walked past that cafe," he said, "I was having a bad week. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of week where things feel heavier than they should. Shop was down 1 mechanic, Nora had been sick. I'd gotten a bill I wasn't ready for." He paused. "I was walking past, and I heard you say that thing about marrying anyone who fixed the chair. I remember. I know you were joking." He glanced at her briefly. "But I stopped because I don't know entirely. It wasn't the joke, it was the sound of it, the frustration underneath the joke. I recognized it." He turned to look at her directly. "I know what it sounds like when someone's been carrying something alone for a long time and the mask slips for a second." She held that. She didn't deflect. "And I thought," he continued, "I can fix this one thing. I can't fix everything. I can't fix the week I'm having. I can't fix whatever she's been carrying. But the chair I can fix." "You fixed it," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Yeah." He looked at the shop window again. "And then you showed up at my shop, and then there was the kid with the motor, and then the dinner with your father, and the event." He paused. "I'm not a complicated person, Vanessa. I know what I have and what I don't. I know what I am. I'm a mechanic in Eagle Rock with a daughter and a truck that needs work I keep putting off." A beat. "But I know when something is real. And I know when I'm standing somewhere I want to stay." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same direct and uncomplicated attention he'd given everything from the very beginning. No performance, no calculation. Just a man telling the truth about where he was, offering it simply, with the exit ramp built in the way he always built it. Not asking her to confirm anything. Not requiring a particular answer, just saying the true thing and leaving the space around it. She said, "I had to think, these last few months, about what I was actually doing, whether I was pursuing something or managing something." She paused. I manage a lot of things. It's how I operate. I can make almost any decision feel strategic if I work at it long enough. I know, he said. I was looking for the strategy in this, she said. The fleet contract, the outreach event, all of it. Telling myself there was a practical logic. She looked at him. There wasn't, or there was, but it wasn't the reason. A pause. The reason was simpler. You made me feel like an ordinary person on a cafe patio. Not the CEO, not the wheelchair. Just a person. She stopped. I hadn't felt that in longer than I want to admit. He was quiet. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be clear about that. I work too much and I manage things I should probably just let be, and I'm going to try to pay you for things you haven't asked to be paid for at least 3 more times before I stop doing it. I know, he said again, and I'm in a chair which, Vanessa. He said her name the way he said things, direct, not unkind, a door gently closed on a sentence that didn't need finishing. I know, I'm standing here anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. He nodded. Okay, he echoed. From inside the shop, Nora's voice. Dad, Morales says I can use the aluminum rod, but I have to sand the ends first. Is that true, or is he making me do extra steps? Landon turned toward the door. He's making you do a necessary step that you'd skip if he didn't tell you to do it. A pause. How do you know? Because I raised you and you hate sanding. I don't hate sanding. You complained about sanding for 40 minutes when we refinished the bookshelf. That was different sanding. A beat. This is important sanding. Then do it, he said, and the sound she made in response was the particular Nora sound that meant she was already doing it. He turned back to Vanessa with an expression that was tired and fond and thoroughly real. The expression of a man for whom parenting is not a performance or a sacrifice narrative, but just the actual texture of his daily life, worn in and familiar and still capable of surprising him. Dinner, he said. This week. Not with your father. Just, yes, she said before he'd finished. He nodded. Wednesday. Wednesday. She went home a different way than she'd come, not deliberately, but because the roads offered it, and she was in no particular hurry, and she wanted the drive. She took surface streets through Glendale and down into Los Feliz and through Silver Lake, and she let the city scroll past the windows in the late afternoon light, which was the November version of golden, thinner than summer, more honest somehow, the kind of light that doesn't flatter so much as illuminate. She thought about what he'd said, about stopping because he recognized the sound of someone who'd been carrying something alone for too long. She thought about the 8-year-old in a shop apron who had spent 2 evenings building a mechanism to solve a problem she'd identified on her own, and who had presented it with the kind of candid confidence that doesn't know yet that it's supposed to be uncertain. She thought about what it meant that the most significant thing that had happened to her in years had begun with a wheelchair breaking down in front of a cafe, with a joke she never meant, with a stranger who stopped when everyone else didn't. There's a version of the story that frames this as luck. Chance alignment, wrong chair, right sidewalk, right moment. And it was that, partly. She wouldn't pretend otherwise, but it was also something else. It was a man who had the habit of stopping, who had built that habit over years, probably from his uncle's shop, probably from the long education of raising a child alone, and learning that most things don't fix themselves and someone has to look, and most of the time that someone is you. He hadn't stopped because of her. He'd stopped because stopping was what he did. Because the thing that was broken was visible, and he had the tools, and not stopping would have required a deliberate act of looking away. She thought about how many people had looked away on that patio. How many of them were not bad people. She didn't believe they were bad people. They were just people who had learned, through the long accumulation of city living and busy schedules and the social awkwardness of disability in public, to let their eyes slide past things they didn't know how to address. She had spent years being the thing people's eyes slid past. Or worse, the thing they stared at with the performative attention of people demonstrating their own sensitivity. And then a man had crouched down and said, "What kind of chair is this? And what did it feel like before it stopped and got to work?" She pulled into the garage beneath her building and sat for a moment in the adapted car in the parking structure, the engine off, the city muffled around her. What she understood now, what the months had built, what the dinner and the shop and the event and the crisis and the small yard and the crumpled diagram and the 2-word Wednesday had built, was this. The life she'd constructed was real. The company was real. The work was real. The choices she'd made were hers, and she stood behind them. She'd built things. She'd built things that mattered and worked, and that 48 million people used, and that she had every right to be proud of. And also, she'd been living in it like it was the whole of the thing, like the building was also the house, like the accomplishment was also the life. It wasn't. It was one room. A large room, an important room, but one room. She went upstairs. The penthouse was the same, beautiful and controlled and quiet in the engineered way. She went to the kitchen and started making actual dinner. Not ordering, not the housekeeper's preparation, but cooking, which she did rarely enough that it required a moment of orientation to the space. She found things in the refrigerator. She made something that was more effort than expertise, and was therefore imperfect in ways a restaurant would not be, and was more satisfying for exactly that reason. She ate at the kitchen island and looked out at the city, and thought about Wednesday. She thought about Nora's mechanism, the aluminum rod being sanded now in a shop in Eagle Rock, the roller spacing being corrected, the thing that didn't work yet being patiently taken apart and rebuilt until it did. She thought about the compliant mechanism, the concept itself, the engineering principle that a structure that yields slightly to an obstacle distributes the load better than one that resists entirely. That flexibility under specific conditions is not weakness, but function. She had spent years building herself rigid. After the accident, after Marcus, after the first and hardest years, she had made herself strong in the specific way of things that don't give. She'd thought that was the goal, strength as the absence of yield. What she understood differently now was that the chair in its broken state had been rigid too. The resistance she'd absorbed into normal, the friction she'd stopped noticing, that was the chair resisting rather than responding. And Landon had fixed it not by making it harder, but by clearing what was jammed and letting it move the way it was designed to. She was not going to become a metaphor for her own wheelchair. She recognized this thought for what it was and declined to pursue it further. But she held the adjacent truth, which was simpler. She was allowed to move more easily. She was allowed to let things in that would make that easier. She was allowed, at 30 years old, at the helm of something real and built by her own work, to also be a person at a kitchen island eating imperfect dinner and thinking about Wednesday with the uncomplicated anticipation of someone who has decided without strategy and without management that this is something she wants. Her phone showed a text from Nora, from Landon's phone, which Nora occasionally commandeered with varying degrees of his knowledge. The text was a photo of the mechanism, the aluminum rods installed, and at the bottom in the text field, the spacing is correct now. Morales says I did it right. He didn't say good job, but he nodded, which is the same thing. Vanessa looked at the photo. She could see the difference in the mechanism. Cleaner, more precise, the logic of it visible now without the distraction of the imperfect execution. She typed back, "That's excellent work. Tell Morales a nod from him counts double." The reply, after a minute, "He says you're right, and also that your sedan needs its brake pads checked next time it comes in." She set the phone down and looked at the city and laughed. The actual kind. The kind that doesn't ask permission first. Gregory called at 8:30. She answered. "How are you?" he said. His version of the question now, direct and genuine, without the performance of casualness. "Good," she said. "Really good." A pause. "Wednesday dinner?" "He told you?" "He texted me to ask where I thought you'd like to go." A beat. "I told him the place in Los Feliz and to make the reservation himself." "Dad?" "He needs to know how to make a reservation in this city. That's useful information regardless." She pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly. "You're impossible." "I'm helpful," he said, with the dignity of a man who believes this. "There's a distinction." "There sometimes is," she said. "Not always." He laughed, quietly, the laugh of someone who knows he deserves the gentle correction and takes it without defense. "I'm proud of you," he said again. "Not for Whitfield, not for the company holding, for the other thing, the way you've let yourself have it." She was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't easy," she said. "I know. The things worth having aren't." A pause. "Your mother would have liked him. She would have liked that he doesn't fuss." Her mother had died when Vanessa was 19, and Gregory rarely mentioned her, not from avoidance, but from a grief that had never fully calcified into something he could carry casually. When he did mention her, it landed with the specific weight of something set down carefully. "I know," Vanessa said. "I thought about that." "Good," he said, and then, "Get some sleep. Wednesday's in 2 days, and you should be rested." "Good night, Dad." "Good night." She sat for a while longer after the call, in the kitchen with the dinner things still on the counter, and the city spread out below in its 10,000 separate lights, each one the window of something: a life, a room, a person moving through their evening with whatever they were carrying and whatever they were glad about and whatever they were working toward. She thought about a mechanic's daughter sanding aluminum rod in Eagle Rock and getting the spacing right and receiving a nod that counted double. She thought about a man who stopped because stopping was what he did, who fixed things because fixable things shouldn't stay broken if you have the tools and the time. She thought about her father, who had spent 64 years loving people in the only language he had and who was, slowly and genuinely, learning a few more words. She thought about herself, not the CEO, not the story the public had constructed around the accident and the recovery and the company, but herself, the actual person inside all of that, who had spent years reinforcing the walls and had found, improbably, that the thing which finally got through them was a broken wheelchair on a cafe patio and a stranger who didn't know enough about her to be impressed. There is something the world gets backwards about strength. It treats it as a quantity. The more you have, the safer you are, the less you can be touched. Build enough of it and nothing reaches you. Build enough of it and you are finally, fully protected. But that's not how it works. That's not how anything that's actually alive works. A tree with no give snaps in the wind. A joint with no flex shatters under load. The thing that holds is not the thing that cannot be moved, but the thing that can be moved and still hold, that absorbs the force and continues. Vanessa Holloway had spent years learning to be unbreakable. It had served her. She didn't regret it. But what she was learning now, in the incremental and imperfect way that the real things are learned, was that the next thing, the harder thing, was not more strength. It was the willingness to let the chair move freely, to stop absorbing the friction into normal, to let someone who knows what they're doing get close enough to look, and to trust that looking is not the same as damage. She turned off the kitchen light and went through the penthouse to the bedroom, and the city did its quiet, three-quarters dark thing outside the windows. And she lay down and felt the particular quality of tired that comes from a day that was full in the right ways. Not depleting, but restoring, the kind of tired that carries you towards sleep rather than away from it. She was asleep before 11 for the first time in longer than she could specifically remember. Outside, Los Angeles held its complicated and unresting life. The noise of it, the distance of it, the millions of separate stories moving through the same geography without knowing each other, intersecting occasionally by chance or choice, or the breakdown of a wheelchair on a West Hollywood sidewalk on an afternoon that no one planned. She slept. In Eagle Rock, in a house that was small enough to know every room by sound, a man checked on his daughter at 10:30 and found her asleep with a book on her chest and the mechanism on the desk beside her bed, the aluminum rods catching the hall light, the spacing correct, the thing that hadn't worked now repaired and waiting. He set the book on the nightstand. He turned off the hall light. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way that parents stand in doorways, taking the inventory of what's there, noting that it's there, holding the plainly extraordinary fact of a person you love sleeping safely in a room you've kept safe for them. He thought about Wednesday. He thought about the particular quality of attention Vanessa had given Nora's mechanism. Not the indulgent attention of a person performing interest for a child, but the actual focus of someone who saw the idea and recognized it for what it was. He thought about the way she'd said the idea is rarer, with the directness of someone stating a fact rather than composing a compliment. He thought about what it meant that he'd stopped on a sidewalk for a reason he still couldn't fully articulate, and that everything since had been, in its imperfect and unplanned and thoroughly human way, exactly what it should have been. He was not a man given to large declarations, internal or otherwise. He didn't think in speeches. He thought in the language of mechanisms, cause and effect, input and output, the thing that's wrong, and the adjustment required. He had looked at his life for the past few years, and it had been, he knew, essentially good. Nora was good. The work was honest. The days had what they needed in them. What he hadn't known was missing was this, the sense of something opening. Not what was there suddenly being insufficient. He refused that framing, had always refused it. but the discovery that the room he was living in had a door he hadn't tried. He pulled Nora's door too, leaving it open a crack the way she liked. He went down the hall. He made sure the front door was locked, the way he always did, the last thing every night, the small and ordinary and entirely unromantic act of keeping things safe. He went to bed. In 2 days it would be Wednesday. On Wednesday there would be dinner at a restaurant he'd already called about accessibility, noting it in the same matter-of-fact way he approached all things that needed to be noted, because the noting mattered and the matter-of-factness mattered equally. After dinner there would be other things. More time, more ordinary days, more of Nora explaining code logic and Morales pretending not to care, and the fleet vehicles coming through the shop, and Gregory Holloway calling to offer opinions he'd mostly been asked for. More friction and more ease and more of the unscheduled afternoons that turn out to be the ones you remember. None of it was smooth, none of it was guaranteed. Two imperfect people with complicated histories and a child between them and a city around them that didn't slow down for anyone. The odds of difficulty were not low, and both of them knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But the chair moved freely now. The spacing was correct. The thing that had been jammed was cleared, and what remained was the mechanism itself, sound and functional, designed for exactly this, for moving forward, adjusting to the surface, carrying its person through whatever the ground turned out to be. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.